So this is a paper that draws on a larger project that I'm working on parallel to my dissertation, and my counselor suddenly arrived. And in this paper, I'm going to be testing out a few ideas that I've been working with, and I hope that we'll have a chance to discuss them in a bit more depth in the Q&A session. So I'll dive into the paper here. In 2018, Joseph E. Uszynski edited a substantial anthology entitled Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe Them that brought together scholars from multiple disciplines to share their research on conspiracy theories. In one of his brief editorial asides, Uszynski lists definitions for the keywords of conspiracy theory research: conspiracy, conspiracy theory, conspiracy belief, etc. Yet he struggles to settle on an adequate and stable definition of conspiracy theorist. He confesses that the term has never been well defined because scholars use it to denote a whole range of characters. He remarks that as most people believe in a conspiracy theory or two, the term could apply to everyone, but this would render the term meaningless. Or conspiracy theorist could refer to people who believe in a specific conspiracy theory, or to people who believe in many conspiracy theories, or professionals who spread conspiracy theories for a living, like Alex Jones, or amateurs who improve upon particular theories, or a person with a high level of conspiracy thinking. Uszynski's succession of ors suggests that each of these definitions are mutually exclusive. Arguably, this absence of a unified definition results from the multidisciplinary nature of conspiracy theory research. Whereas some social psychologists tend to be interested in test subjects who exhibit conspiracy ideation, some historians prefer to concentrate on those professionals who have turned conspiracy theorizing into a career. In the end, Uszynski resolves this multidisciplinary muddle by advising contributors either to avoid the term altogether or to define exactly what they mean when they use it. This is a pragmatic editorial remedy that seeks to project a sense of scholarly consensus for the purposes of an academic publication. Yet, I suspect that it might be more intellectually generative to reflect on this unsettling indefinability at the heart of conspiracy theory research. Why does the meaning of this term remain simultaneously so obvious, yet so elusive? The classic disavowal, "I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but," suggests that most people would rather not be associated with this term. As the sociologists Gina Husting and Martin Orr argue, the act of calling someone a conspiracy theorist operates as a transpersonal strategy of exclusion. When you label someone as a conspiracy theorist, you undermine and devalue their claims, as well as their competence to make such claims. This is a strategy that helps to preserve a stable political consensus that sets the borders of legitimate versus risible statements and intellectually competent actors versus paranoiacs. Husting and Orr point out that not only does this strategy discredit the claims and competencies of paranoiacs, but also protects certain decisions and people from questions in arenas of political, cultural, and scholarly knowledge construction. Although the term conspiracy theorist is not always precisely defined, it often performs a powerful delegitimizing function. There is a certain group of people who possess the authority to deploy this conspiracy theory label effectively. Husting and Orr claim that those who can banish the conspiracy theorists from public discourse tend to be trusted and legitimated intellectuals, such as trained journalists and university-affiliated academics. Whenever these figures speak or write about conspiracy theorists, they tend to portray them as the discursive antithesis of the intellectual. Whereas the intellectual practices rational thought, sober discussion, and diligent research, the conspiracy theorist comes across as a scatterbrained maverick whose conspiratorial aspersions and allegations lack rigor and credibility. In fact, it is almost impossible to describe the conspiracy theorist without simultaneously somehow evoking an image of the intellectual. In his 1987 book, Legislators and Interpreters, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman contends that the self-definition of the intellectual demands the stigmatization and ostracization of the non-intellectual. During the age of modernity, the educated elite used its own mode of life as the benchmark against which to measure and classify other forms of life, past or present, as underdeveloped, immature, incomplete, and otherwise inferior stages or versions of itself. And this is where the idea of the pre-modern emerges that Curtis was discussing in his analysis of Kazam. As Bauman puts it, modern intellectuals acquired the role of guarding and gardening the boundary between the wild culture of pre-modern times and the garden culture of modernity. They aimed to cultivate and educate the unruly and irrational masses whose superstitious and regressive beliefs offended the enlightened sensibilities of the intellectual. Such a conception of the people as unmodern and unintelligent was constituted as a byproduct of the self-constitution of the intellectuals. The notion of the conspiracy theorists stems in part from this longer tradition of establishing discursive and institutional boundaries between the intellectual and the non-intellectual. The existence of these boundaries determines, who has the authority to speak about political events and social processes, who receives funding to support their research, etc. Yet these boundaries are neither fixed nor permanent. They can erode as certain institutions lose their prestige and cease to guarantee standards of truth and goodness. They can be contested as new groups or movements demand and receive recognition for their own rationalities and methodologies. They demand constant revision and rejuvenation as intellectuals and institutions adapt to new technologies, paradigms, and practices. What does not change about these boundaries, however, is the continual need for exclusions. And I contend that the term conspiracy theorist emerged historically during one of these moments of exclusion and continue to operate in a very similar fashion. The philosopher of science, Thomas F. Gieryn, suggests that the process of boundary work often fulfills this need for exclusion. Gieryn uses the example of the demarcation of science from non-science to characterize boundary work as the attribution of selected characteristics to the institutions of science for the purposes of constructing a social boundary that distinguishes some intellectual activities as non-science. In other words, boundary work produces an image of the intellectual against which intellectuals can distinguish themselves from their rivals and their enemies. It enforces the boundary between the intellectual and the non-intellectual by branding others with delegitimizing prefixes such as pseudo or quasi. Yet the true purpose of this boundary work is not to carefully define the nature of the pseudo-intellectual or the practices of pseudoscience. As the historian Michael D. Groden joked in a recent interview, there's no such thing as pseudoscience. It's not the case that someone gets up in the morning and says, I'm a pseudoscience scientist, so I'm going to go to my pseudo lab and make up some pseudo stuff. In fact, the practice of boundary work reveals more about how individuals perceive themselves than how they classify the actors and activities on the other side of the boundary. And this legacy of boundary work, as the sociologists Gieryn Harambam and Steph Orpus claim, has shaped our common assumptions about the conspiracy theorist. Harambam and Orpus claim that academic claims about conspiracy theorists as bad scientists and religious believers are not simple empirical descriptions, but rather efforts to maintain the status and social position of intellectuals in the broader field of knowledge production. The earliest and most influential definitions of the conspiracy theorist from Karl Popper's 1948 lecture towards a rational theory of tradition onwards appear to express a sense of anxiety or fear about the possibility that conspiracy theorists might be mistaken for intellectuals. Thinkers such as Popper and Hofstadter seem to dread the prospect that conspiracy theory might turn out to be virtually indistinguishable from social theory or historical scholarship. What worries them is the uncanny family resemblance between the conspiracy theorist and the intellectual. The very act of defining the conspiracy theorist works to reaffirm the intellectual superior and socially mandated capacity to distinguish, separate, and evaluate. Yet, modern intellectuals did not experience the need to discuss or define the conspiracy theorist until they felt that their authority was waning. The historian Katerina Talman defines the early scholarly literature on conspiracy theory as a series of reactions to certain historical, political, and socio-cultural events and transformations that were perceived as attacks on intellectualism, the autonomy of the sciences, and democratic. Okay, what's that? Hang on. Oh gosh, I'm having a little bit of audio issues at the moment. Sorry. There we go. Everything's fine now. Where was I? So the rise of mass society, the historical trauma of World War II and the ravages of the Red Scare pushed Western intellectuals to defend their role as the guardians of modernity. The emergence of conspiracy theory research or conspiracy theory addressed the need to assert a new boundary between the proper intellectuals and their new competitors for the public's attention. The post-war period saw a range of intellectuals engaged in a process of boundary work to insist that these new people who may act and sound like intellectuals are actually conspiracy theorists. Many of these efforts defined the conspiracy theorist as someone who lacked the personal qualities of the true intellectual. And so what emerges is often a definition of the conspiracy theorist that is based less on what they are or what they do, and more on what they are not or what they do not do. In the rest of this paper, I demonstrate that the notion of the conspiracy theorist is a fundamentally relational concept with a definition that shifts according to what the definer perceives as the purpose and personality of the intellectual. I examined the writers of Popper and Hofstadter. I really wanted to get into also the writings of Daniel Pipes and Kazam, but unfortunately I had to cut that bit, but I wanted to focus on more canonical definitions of the conspiracy theorist. So I examined their writings briefly to consider how they set the boundary between the intellectual and the conspiracy theorist. Yet I do not confine my investigation solely to the perspective of the intellectuals. I also note that Gary Allen, who both identifies and is identified as a conspiracy theorist, participates in a kind of reverse boundary work to introduce a positive and even celebratory definition of the conspiracy theorist. Once I've dealt with these examples, I'll review a handful of attempts to propose a possible alternative to the term conspiracy theorist. And finally, I will conclude that we should cease to distinguish the conspiracy theorist from the intellectual and start to find ways to analyze conspiracy theorists as intellectuals. And this would require more of a shift towards the kind of work that's done within the field of the sociology of intellectuals. But let's get into Popper. In his 1948 lecture Towards a Rational Theory of Tradition and the 1952 edition of The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper declares that conspiracy theories are the very opposite of the true aim of the social sciences. He argues that the people who approach the social sciences with a ready-made conspiracy theory in mind thereby deny themselves the possibility of ever understanding the task of the social sciences. Unlike the conspiracy theorist, the true social theorist recognizes that the persistence of institutions and collectives creates a problem to be solved in terms of an analysis of individual social actions and their unintended social consequences. For Popper, no one can impose their will on the entirety of social life without coming into conflict with the activities and agendas of other individuals, institutions, and collectives. In other words, conspiracy theorists can never produce an adequate theory of society because one of the striking things about social life is that it never comes off exactly as intended. Whereas the conspiracy theorist clings onto the opinion that everything comes down to conscious design and in intentionality, the social theorist understands that social life is full of accidents, coincidences, and inadvertent consequences. The conspiracy theorist enters the social sciences with a closed hypothesis. The social theorist's hypothesis remains open to unintended consequences. Ultimately, Popper's critique of conspiracy theory has more to do with the character and the practices of the conspiracy theorist. They suffer from closed minds and closed hypotheses. The Popperian rationalist practices clear and critical thinking to decipher the meaning of social phenomena. The conspiracy theorist, however, succumbs far too often to the whims of emotion and passion to say anything interesting or insightful about political events and social processes. For Popper, the conspiracy theorist is simply too weak-willed and over-emotional to ever relinquish their belief in hypotheses of conspiracy, no matter how many times they are refuted or debunked. And so what bothers Popper most about the conspiracy theorist is their failure to be an intellectual or live up to this standard of intellectual conduct. Hofstadter shares Popper's intuition that conspiracy theorists, I should add, lack the personality or disposition that defines the intellectual. Hofstadter's dissection of paranoid scholarship in Paranoid Style and American Politics stands as his most assertive and explicit attempt to draw a firm line between the intellectual and the conspiracy theorist. He regards conspiracy theories as works of paranoid scholarship that are nothing if not scholarly in technique. For instance, he marvels at the 100 pages of bibliography and endnotes in Robert Welch's tract, The Politician. Yet, despite the visible accomplishments of their technique, Hofstadter insists that this paranoid scholarship should not be taken seriously. As Talman observes, Hofstadter's vehement denunciation of the respectable paranoid literature suggests an implicit alarmism. Arguably, Hofstadter perceives that the boundary between the intellectual and the conspiracy theorist is starting to dissolve and wishes to reassert the value of traditional academic scholarship. Like Popper, he points out that the traditional procedure of paranoid scholarship is to start out with defensible assumptions and a careful accumulation of facts, and to marshal these facts towards an overwhelming proof of the particular conspiracy that is to be established. For Hofstadter, the conspiracy theorist always operates within a closed hypothesis as they hunt obsessively for the historical evidence that supports their extravagant conclusion. What strikes Hofstadter as absurd and aberrant about paranoid scholarship is the elaborate concern with demonstration it almost invariably shows. Even if this evidence is properly researched and cited, Hofstadter does not believe that this abundance of content compensates for the distorted and ill-conceived form of these conspiracy theories. The intensely rationalistic nature of paranoid scholarship for Hofstadter results in a pathological form of hyperscience that may appear scholarly, yet lacks the sensible judgment of the intellectual. Yet he discusses John Robinson's conspiracy theory, as he discusses John Robinson's conspiracy theory about the role of the Illuminati in the French Revolution. Hofstadter comments that what is missing is not veracious information about the organization, but sensible judgment about what can cause a revolution. Without sensible judgment, the conspiracy theorist does nothing more than collect facts and compile footnotes as part of his careful preparation for the big leap from the undeniable to the unbelievable. Both Popper and Hofstadter's work introduce a standard of intellectual conduct against which they judge the character of the conspiracy theorist. You know, the intellectual has the open hypothesis, the conspiracy theorist has the closed hypothesis. The intellectual for Hofstadter has the judgment, the conspiracy theorist lacks judgment. And those who fall short of this standard are grouped together under a single label that dismisses everyone who believes in conspiracy theories as equally irrational, as people who succumb to emotional pangs and social paranoia. And then this is extrapolated to conclude that all conspiracy theories are prima facie false because of the character of the people who come up with them or believe in them or suggests fidelity to them. And so taken together, Popper and Hofstadter's boundary work helped to establish a notion of the conspiracy theorist that was always more about demarcation than definition. Of course, the construction of this boundary between the conspiracy theorist and the intellectual has not always been a one-sided affair. As Talman observes, the 1970s saw the emergence of a counter-discourse on conspiracy theories as conspiracy theorists embraced their marginal discursive position and constructed their identity in opposition to mainstream discourse. For instance, Gary Allen's 1971 underground bestseller, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, crafted a new positive identity for conspiracy theorists. In the opening pages of the book, Allen reverses the terms of the established boundary between the intellectual and the conspiracy theorist. He portrays intellectuals as the true pathological pseudo-scholars who believe in a delusional theory of history. As Allen quips, if you believe a political event is all an accident or the result of mysterious and unexplainable tides of history, you will be regarded as an intellectual who understands we live in a complex world. Allen contends that so-called intellectuals refuse to accept a conspiratorial theory of history because they have a strong vested emotional interest in the accidental theory of history. Just as Popper suggests that conspiracy theorists are emotionally incapable of proper social theory, Allen argues that intellectuals are too psychologically weak to acknowledge the truth of conspiracy theories. According to Allen, public intellectuals use ridicule and satire to portray conspiracy theorists as buffoonish cranks whose claims do not deserve scholarly attention or honest scrutiny. And this is a partially true claim, I think. Only those with a strong character, such as Allen, can understand this onslaught of mockery and expose the facts of the global conspiracy. In this sense, Allen is flipping the normal assumptions and implications of the boundary to accuse the intellectuals of lacking the venerable qualities that the intellectuals usually accuse the conspiracy theorists of lacking. Although Allen's gesture of reverse boundary work can seem slightly self-aggrandizing, it reveals something significant. Even when Allen is proposing a much more flattering conception of the conspiracy theorist, he cannot detach it from its disapproving cousin from across the boundary, that is, the intellectual. In a certain sense, these two terms continue to be tied to one another, and how you use them will often depend on how you position yourself in relation to this shifting and provisional boundary. Just as Popper and Hofstadter used the term conspiracy theorist to defend a certain authoritative regime of knowledge production, Allen uses it to challenge and question their authority. And I sense that the differing ideological functions of the term, which derives from this long legacy of boundary work, has tended to compromise its usefulness as an interpretive or analytical category. To put it succinctly, the term conspiracy theorist works better as a political tool, a marker of political identity, than as a frame or a lens through which we can understand more about the people who believe in and articulate conspiracy theories. Consequently, I wonder whether it might be necessary or desirable to rethink our use of this term. And I should clarify that I do not want to revise the term because I feel that calling someone a conspiracy theorist isn't very good manners, or because I think that we should stage more public debates with certain conspiracy theorists to hear them out. I know that many of the things that we call conspiracy theories are unwarranted and harmful, but I do not think that the term conspiracy theorist and the conceptual baggage that it carries provides a helpful starting point for understanding the people who believe in them. As I noted in the first few paragraphs of this paper, it is a term that lacks a genuinely useful or unified definition. And so in the last few paragraphs of this paper, I want to consider what we should do about the notion of the conspiracy theorist. And as far as I can tell, we have three options. The first is to salvage and sanitize the term, to try to develop a purely descriptive and non-pejorative concept of the conspiracy theorist to lessen some of the negative connotations that the term currently possesses. Michael Buter, for instance, holds that this solution may encourage others not to deploy the term simply to exclude certain people and perspectives from public discourse. Yet, I think that we still encounter some of the issues that Uzinski raised. The term conspiracy theorist is neither sharp enough to denote specific forms of conspiracy theorizing and conspiracy belief, nor is it elastic enough to encompass all the kinds of people who promote or believe in conspiracy theories adequately or in a satisfying manner. So we may be able to address this issue by adopting the second option and refining or expanding our conceptual vocabulary. In their 2014 book, The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, and their 2018 article, The Problem of Conspiracism, Dentif suggests that one ought to distinguish between the ordinary group of conspiracy theorists, those who report on and expose real conspiracies, and the more pernicious kinds of conspiracists, like Alex Jones, David Icke, etc. The conspiracy theorist in this framework tends to assess the evidence for a particular conspiracy theory carefully before they judge it to be true. So we could call Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward conspiracy theorists within this framework. And the conspiracists, however, will rant about rumors of conspiracy without even consulting the relevant evidence. And as Dentif points out, conspiracists are simply one kind of conspiracy theorist, and it is a mistake to treat conspiracists as representative of conspiracy theorists in general. And I think we can also split conspiracy theorist up into certain different terms. And so I agree here with Rambam, who argues in the Routledge Handbook of Conspiracy Theories that we should substitute the generic term conspiracy theorist with more analytically precise terms that differentiate between the various kinds of conspiracy theorizing. He proposes the alternatives of conspiracy entrepreneur, conspiracy movement, and conspiracy individual. The conspiracy entrepreneur denotes someone who spreads and shares conspiracy theories professionally, someone who's turned it into a brand identity. A conspiracy movement, such as the 9/11 Truth Movement or QAnon, represents the coming together of many individuals to construct and celebrate a collective conspiracy narrative, so a narrative that's made by many different authors. The conspiracy individual refers to someone who may casually believe that the CIA killed JFK or that the American government is concealing information about UFOs. They may believe other conspiracy theories, but they haven't looked into it. It isn't a massive feature in their life. And Rambam hopes that these alternative terms will capture something of the diversity of actors and activities within contemporary conspiracy cultures and milieus. Although I find these distinctions helpful, I suspect that these terms continue to reinscribe the same old boundary. The inclusion of the qualifier conspiracy implies that there is still something inherently non-intellectual or abnormal about those who propagate or believe in conspiracy theories. And I wonder whether there's anything we can do to eliminate any residue of boundary work from our research on conspiracy theories. The third option, which is much more speculative, is to abandon the term altogether. It would be to acknowledge that the phrase conspiracy theorist can never be decoupled from a normative conception of the intellectual, and that it can never be dislodged from the framework of generalism that regards all conspiracy theories and those who believe them as equally irrational. Instead of establishing ever finer boundaries between the conspiracy theorist and the intellectual, we can search for approaches and methodologies that allow us to analyze the people we would traditionally call conspiracy theorists as kinds of intellectuals. What may help us in this procedure is the work of the sociologist Jerome Carabel, who's worked a lot on the issue of defining intellectuals. And he makes a distinction between the normative tradition and the analytical tradition. As Carabel puts it, the fundamental problem of the normative tradition is that it treats intellectuals not as they are, but as they should be, as that ideal image of the intellectual that we've discussed that more often operates to serve the purpose of boundary work. Contrary to this tradition, he proposes an analytical framework that concentrates on identifying the conditions and processes that shape the actual political consciousness and conditions of different groups of intellectuals. And I sense that the field of conspiracy theory research may benefit from this sort of shift from the normative to the analytical, and it may even yield a new conceptual vocabulary that escapes a legacy of boundary work and contains terms that refer more specifically to the particular types of conspiracy theorizing that are not ordinarily covered by the blanket term conspiracy theorist. Of course, I do not really think it would be right for me to right now propose a new set of terms that everyone else should adopt. I think that these new terms, whatever they might be, should arise more organically from the close and concrete study of particular conspiracy theories rather than conspiracy theory in general. And as a result, I imagine these terms might not be generally applicable to all instances of conspiracy theorizing. Our way of conceptualizing and describing the work of Lyndon LaRouche might be markedly different from the way that we talk about Mort Stahl. However, the question of what we do about the term conspiracy theorist remains an open and ongoing debate. And I hope that this paper in some way or other helped to move this debate forward or in to new directions that may be fruitful. So I'll end the paper there. That's all right.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I might start to refer to myself as a complot or mischief investigator rather than a conspiracy theorist instead. A quick note before we move on to the questions. Joe's editorial note. I don't think he actually told the authors of those individual chapters to do that before he wrote it. I think that's a post hoc generalization that Joe put into the book. Because I certainly was not given that note, although then again, Joe wanted me to write a chapter on definition. So maybe he just told me to avoid it. Our first question comes from Charles. It's more of a comment on the interesting use case of Daniel Pipes. Pipes is an interesting character. He denounces conspiracy theories, yet he is the son of Richard Pipes, who proposes a conspiratorial analysis of the October Revolution, arguing in particular that small conspiratorial causes can have big historical effects. Thoughts?
Fantastic. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Charles, for that comment. And I think this relates to one of the points in your original paper about Popper, about the criteria of consummation, is that many critics of conspiracy theories will have a belief in historical conspiracies that take place, but then they impose this criteria of consummation. And so you also see this in Popper, where he slyly admits that the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Third Reich are conspiracies, but he says that they, even though they succeeded to a certain extent, they didn't come off exactly as they intended, but they are conspiracies that worked, and so I would, yeah, I ought to look more into the work of Richard Pipes, but yeah, thank you very much for your point, Charles. Sorry, that may have been a little all over the place, but I appreciate the comment.
And we have another comment from Martin Orr, who, even though he's a sociologist by using comments, is talking more like a philosopher. I'm really struck by the use of Gieryn and boundary work here. And it puts me in the mind of Macumber's Time in the Ditch, Amateur Philosophy in McCarthy. McCarthy era. Ironically, I think of Kassam and the fact that boundary maintenance among intellectuals like Kassam can also be read as part of a fundamentally political stream of US philosophy that powerfully shapes US philosophy from mid-century and before till now. A nice link between you and Curtis Hagen's papers here.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for that that point, and I agree. I think there's been plenty of work on that topic. I think that it's Lawrence de Haven Smith who talks about Karl Popper and Leo Strauss and their role within a sort of formation of neoliberal philosophers, and how that ideology informs their own critiques of conspiracy as a way to explain historical events, in opposition to progressive historians like Charles Beard. And also I think that Katerina Talman and also Alexander Dunt talk about the emergence of conspiracy theory research and also writing on conspiracy theories in American academia, in psychology, philosophy, history, and also literature as deeply shaped by the way that the Cold War had an effect on the formation of different disciplines and departments in the American university, and also how American academics then had an antipathy towards pointing out conspiracies that the United States government was engineering towards other nations and also their own population. I mean, Curtis has also raised the examples of MK Ultra and COINTELPRO as classic instances of conspiracies that were also going on at this time. But yeah,
I should also
thank you very much, Martin.
point out Martin's point. Yeah, sorry, I should point out Martin's point actually may have been Jenna's point due to a hilarious Zoom mistake. Jenna is also logged in as a different instance of Martin Orr. So there are two Martins, but only one Martin is the real Martin, and I now don't know which one is which. We have a final question here from Logan Spence. I am curious about reading social critiques of conspiracy theories. I am currently working on a project examining how the 1619 Project uses particular types of conspiracy theory rhetoric as a way to call out systemic racism and the racist erasure of Black histories in America. However, I know some people in my field of communication studies will knee-jerk respond under the presumption that I am attacking the project when I'm doing the opposite, saying that conspiracy theorizing can actually be a good way for social liberation. Do you think the overuse of the paranoid style among scholars has scared them away from considering conspiratorial elements in social critiques?
That's a fantastic question. I know that there are a couple of things. I mean, there's a great literature on the use of conspiratorial explanations in the critiques of monopolies and inequality in the Gilded Age, and so how certain left-wing groups in America would use the rhetoric of conspiracy to critique how certain plutocrats were hoarding the wealth or gaining a monopoly on certain industries. And it became a way of developing critiques of plutocracy within American capitalism. So I think not only is it a useful tool within social critiques, but it can also be a stage towards it can also be a stage towards popularizing social critiques for wider audiences.